by the scene on the street.
How did you leave it with the Chinese? Because somehow it seems to me that there's this large cake that you really ought to get a slice of it from the Chinese.
From the Chinese.
So that's one line. And then there's the other line is the U.S. And you can tell the Americans that the Chinese made you this offer. Then I think one could get the IMF to speed it up in order to liberate that money. So go for the jugular.
His point is, by having such an offer in your hand, going to them to say, yeah, we know we can't do this, but just look at the potential. You're not helping us. You're not allowing someone else to help us, I think. Yeah. You know? Today I'm going to meet with President Bush. Just let him know how well we're doing and guess his political blessings for the support on our debt. China is still way down on the totem pole when it comes to partnership and support for Liberia's development. They're just starting. Yes, they have big plans. Yes, they have big appetite for raw material, but for us, the United States relationship is still the number one. They set the pace. When they take a step, much of the rest of the world follow, including China. Then I'm out of here. I get away from this ice.
Madam President, thanks for coming. I'm thrilled to call you friend. And we want to help you. We really do.
As we told you, we just needed to get this debt off our backs.
That's right. You were wondering whether or not it was possible to achieve your dreams. And you asked for our help. I was impressed by your spirit, and so I pledge our ongoing help. Thank you, Madam President. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
The United States currently holds $391 million in outstanding bilateral claims on Liberia. We will cancel that debt, all of it, under the framework for highly indebted countries.
We've started. It's a long road. It was always going to be a long road. We need time to make more progress and then sustain the effort to make the progress we have to make in Liberia. On Sunday, there is some arms that arrived from Nigeria. Well, it makes me feel like a real woman. I'm just kidding. It has been a good year, but a tough year. It has been a fruitful, but a challenging first year. Today, we can walk with pride and dignity. All of the progress that we've made can be attributed to the fact that we've got strong women leadership in the government. These are all strong women that have led the processes of change and renewal. With with all the problems and all the scares, I remain optimistic that that Liberia will rise again.
Members of Sirleaf's family reportedly held government positions under her presidency, including bright-eyed, full of optimism, but also widely viewed as unflinching and hailed Liberia's Iron Lady. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf shouldered the responsibility of a country racked by years of brutal civil war.
Liberia today is at one of those key moments. Our joint effort together over the next few months, the next year and beyond, will determine the future course of the nation.
Sirleaf did manage to get almost $5 billion in debt relief, increase foreign investment, build relationships with international health and human rights NGOs, and ultimately help the country rebuild after years of war.
Overall, she was what Liberia needed after the war, someone who could unite the country and someone who could bring some sense of international stability to the country.
We sat down with Liberian journalist Rodney Sia, who covered this president closely throughout her tenure, to talk about Sirleaf's legacy, because there's more to her story than the traditionally rosy Western media narrative. Sirleaf was born in the country's capital of Monrovia in 1938, and politics ran in her blood. She was the daughter of the first indigenous Liberian to serve in the country's legislature. It's important to mention that during this time, there was a divide between the indigenous population of Liberia and former American slaves called Americo-Liberians, who had settled in Monrovia. The Americo-Liberians created a hierarchical society that suppressed the indigenous population, denying them basic rights. Sirleaf was thrust into the middle of this divide.
My feet are in two worlds. The world of poor rural women with no respite from hardship, and the world of accomplished Liberian professionals.
She studied in the United States before returning to Liberia to begin her government career at the Treasury Department. In the early 70s, she worked as assistant finance minister for then-President William Tolbert. Throughout the 70s, and despite her critiques of Tolbert's policies, she rose through the ranks to become the first woman finance minister in Liberia. But shortly after, violence would decimate the government. In 1980, President Tolbert and over a dozen other high-ranking government officials were murdered in a coup, staged by military leader Samuel Doe, who would go on to become the first indigenous leader of Liberia. Sirleaf was one of 4 ministers who were spared. She fled the country soon thereafter. But in 1985, when Doe held elections in an attempt to legitimize his regime, Sirleaf returned to run for the vice presidency. She was subsequently arrested and jailed more than once for criticizing him, and though she won a seat in the Senate, she refused the position on grounds that Doe's election had been fraudulent. Eventually, she left again to work in the US. All the while, Liberia was plunged into years of violent civil warfare. Then there was another coup. The warlord Charles Taylor, who led the rebel uprising called the National Patriotic Front of Liberia, or NPFL, toppled Doe's government in 1990, leading to years of violence. Sirleaf initially supported Taylor, but his brutal tactics eventually alienated her. This initial support is an issue that still follows her to this day. She was even accused of war crimes in a lawsuit and by Liberia's Truth and Reconciliation Commission over her support for rebel movements, including Taylor's. In 1997, after a peace treaty was brokered between the warring factions, Liberia held elections, and Sirleaf ran against Taylor. He won in a landslide, but Sirleaf was seen as a serious contender. In 2003, Taylor went into exile amid pressure from resistance movements like the Women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace. After his exile, Sirleaf helped lead the transitional government before accepting her party's presidential nomination.
And in November 2005, Sirleaf won the presidential election with 59% of the vote and officially became the first woman elected president of an African country. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf represented hope for a better future to a country left decimated by war, where the UN estimated 80% of citizens lived below the poverty line after Charles Taylor resigned. She knew economics. She vowed to fight corruption. And she made many other promises, among them to address issues plaguing women. Throughout her tenure, Sirleaf was touted by Western media as the woman who had shattered Africa's political glass ceiling. Her acclaim eventually peaked in 2011 when she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize alongside 2 women activists. She was re-elected in a landslide victory just days later. But then things started to go downhill.
It wasn't until maybe midway into her government or toward the end of her administration of her second term that some people began to say, look, maybe there's something happening here. And so the issues of corruption, issues of nepotism, she hired some of her relatives to work in the government, which created a lot of backlash from people. So those things kind of tainted her image and her legacy.
Indeed, as many as 20 members of Sirleaf's family reportedly held government positions under her presidency, including her sons, in top advisory, financial, and security positions. Sirleaf rejected accusations of nepotism and corruption, arguing she simply hired the best people for the job.
I stand by my record, and I stand by the record of my family very firmly.
Her administration was also tied up in a bribery scandal with a British mining company, accused of turning over a third of Liberia's land to private investors for things like palm oil production and logging, and failing to consult or adequately compensate the communities that lived on and around that land. She also fired several ministers for allegedly stealing government funds. And though Sirleaf highlighted the importance of press freedom, she failed to ever pass a law that protected journalists from reporting on issues like this. Sia was among those jailed during her tenure, after his newspaper published an investigative report in 2013 exposing a missing $6 million in government funds. The minister involved was removed from his position, but Sia ultimately paid the price when he was sued for libel.
I was found guilty and sentenced to 5,000 years in prison. And that imprisonment kind of led to a lot of international uproar and tainted the legacy of Madame Sirleaf.
5,000 years.
Yeah.
Is that standard for journalists?
Well, the punishment was $1.5 million. And in Liberia, if you can't pay, they suggest that you pay $25 a day. It would take me 5,000 years to pay that money, thus the 5,000-year prison sentence.
After several months in prison, a hunger strike, and significant international uproar, he was released. But Sirleaf's problems continued. In 2014, Liberia was hit with an Ebola epidemic that would take the lives of more than 4,800 people in Liberia in less than 2 years. Sirleaf called this time the lowest point of her presidency.
If we haven't done enough so far, I've come here to apologize to you for that.
And the criticisms didn't stop there.
Do you think she came out with a strong legacy on women?
It was a kind of disappointing era for women under Sirleaf, especially the issue of rape.
Sirleaf did come out strongly in favor of supporting a comprehensive anti-rape law at the very beginning of her presidency, but it was eventually amended to make rape a bailable offense. The underlying issue, says Sia, was enforcement, with the government often failing to prosecute even high-profile rape cases. Overall, critics say Sirleaf may have contributed to the patriarchal norms that already existed in Liberia by doing things like waiting until her last day in office to ban female genital mutilation, a ban that's only good for a year and only applies to children, as well as surrounding herself with a largely male cabinet and even equating feminism to extremism. There was only one woman candidate in the last presidential election, and Parliament is still just 12% female. By 2012, only about 2/3 of citizens approved of Sirleaf's performance, and by 2015, that number was halved to just 1/3. In spite of it all, Sirleaf did manage to get almost $5 billion in debt relief, increase foreign investment, build relationships with international health and human rights NGOs, and ultimately help the country rebuild after years of war. These accomplishments culminated, controversially, in her being awarded the prestigious $5 million Ibrahim Prize in 2018, an award presented to democratically elected African heads of state who turned over power, including Nelson Mandela. Still, Sirleaf acknowledged that the country wasn't quite where she wanted it to be leaving office.
It hasn't all been easy. I've had my share of failures. But I'm so glad that the success have exceeded the failures, and that's why where I am today. I was able to rise above the failures and rise above the difficulties.
So what kind of legacy do you think Ellen Johnson Sirleaf left behind? Let me know in the comments or on Twitter. And thanks for tuning in to Now This World. If you want to see more narrative stories like these, make sure to like and subscribe.
So, I don't understand what Nigerian government and her people really truly are up to. What they stand for and what they are doing, only God really knows.
President Paul Kagame, current chair of the African Union Authority and President of the Republic of Rwanda. President Alassane Ouattara, President of the Republic of La Côte d'Ivoire. Laureate and former President Pedro Pires, former President Mary Robinson, former Prime Minister Haile Mariam Desalegn, Dr. Musa Mohammed, Chairman of the African Union Commission, Dr. Salim Ahmed Salim, Chair of the Prize Committee of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, the board and members of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, participants of the Mo Ibrahim Governance Weekend, friends, greetings to all of you. President Paul Kagame, thank you for your generous support for this weekend's program. As I look around at Rwanda's development today, it is light years away from the conditions that existed when we led the UNDP roundtable for the country in 1994. We all take to heart the following words from your radio broadcast a few weeks ago. You said, "What we are doing here in Rwanda is not a miracle, nor it is impossible anywhere. It is simply the commitment of an entire nation, especially Rwanda youth and women." I applaud your steadfast vision and your leadership and the implementation of that vision. I commend you and your colleagues in the government and the private sector for the many innovations introduced in Rwanda. Africans have a lot to learn from one another. Many of the solution providers are here in this room tonight. To my dear friend, Mo Ibrahim, I believe that when historians reflect upon Africa's transformation, they will note that the 2006 establishment of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation and its governance index, measuring leadership based upon its impact upon the well-being of a population, was a vital inflection point for our continent. Many of our countries are driving for the ideals defined in the Charter of the Foundation. Progress is uneven, but undisputably evident, as many leaders, myself included, have benefited from your direct approach and straight talk. I'm honored to be this year's recipient of the Mo Ibrahim Prize for Achievement in African Leadership. I believe this distinction and receive it on behalf of the many women and men who helped to navigate the profound complexities of the post-conflict country that is Liberia. As the first woman to receive this award, it is my hope that women and girls across Africa will be inspired to break through barriers, to push back the frontiers of possibilities. Where there's a first, there will be a second, and a third, and a fourth. I'm grateful that the Mo Ibrahim Foundation sought to emphasize the post-conflict consolidation of Liberia's democracy under my 2 terms in office. Indeed, my most proud accomplishment is that after decades of violent conflict, the power in Liberia today rests where it should, with the people grounded in the rule of law and upheld by institutions. We take great pride that Liberia, as was mentioned by Dr. Salim Ahmed Salim, was the only country to improve in every category and subcategory of the Ibrahim Index of African Governance, a testament to all those who served in my government. We must remember that it is not that long ago when Liberia was considered a pariah state. Decades of ruinous civil and regional war upended our democratic institutions, decimated our infrastructure, deprived a generation of educational and economic opportunity, and undermined the moral fabric of our society. But from the ashes of war, we rebuilt. We transformed the economy from a growth rate of less than 0 to more than 8.7% average until 2013, when the country was devastated by the Ebola virus. We survived that shock and returned to a trajectory of progress. Today, Liberia's public institutions have the capacity to respond to the needs of its citizens through decentralized county service centers. Infrastructure has been repaired and restored, and roads now connect urban centers and farmers to markets. With the increasing provision of electricity, potable water, and new technologies, cities and towns are bustling with life, creativity, powered by the country's youth. More importantly, friends, with your support, this August, the resilient people of Liberia will celebrate 15 years of uninterrupted peace. Yet, Liberia remains a fragile state. Institutions are still young and being tested, and resources remain scarce. Nations in a state of fragility, particularly post-conflict nations, need special attention and support. We ask that supporters and partners remain focused on Liberia so the country can continue its emergence as a post-conflict success story. Dear friends, I am 6 months shy of my 80th birthday. God has granted me many blessings. Among them, a long and healthy life, and a cadre of family and friends which have carried me through life's trials and tribulations. God has also bequeathed upon me a restless spirit, one that is never fully satisfied, always believing that things can be better. For Liberians, for Africa, for people in poverty, for women and girls around the world. And now, after 8 decades, I have come to realize that this is an impatience which at certain times in my life felt to be an unrelenting burden. It's actually a gift, a great treasure. I'm convinced that this restless spirit, in part, which drove me to public service and like a wind against my back, propelled me forward toward dreams I had yet even to visualize. I submit that this is the same sense of disquiet and impatience that I share with Mo, with President Kagame, with the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, and most of you in this audience. I submit that it is a restlessness that took hold of our fallen sister, Winnie Madikizela Mandela. Giving her the fiercest of courage to stand up against the apartheid state, despite the imprisonment of her husband, and in the face of physical and psychological abuse. Her indomitable spirit will continue to drive me through my remaining years. Speaking of women of unyielding strength, among those in this audience is Lucia Masali Yala. She was my cellmate during several months of confinement in a military prison in 1985. Her body was brutalized by soldiers, but her soul remained unscathed. From that shared trauma, we formed a friendship which has indeed endured for over 30 years. Lucia, a young university student at the time, please stand up and be recognized. Thank you. Thank you. Looking back, it seems like every day I was fighting for something or someone. The right to be heard and to be taken seriously. The right for society to have free speech and enjoy fundamental human rights. To end the deprivation of the Liberian people. To establish peace and build democratic institutions. To create jobs, expand livelihoods, and offer basic social services. To educate the girl child, to stop the deadly Ebola virus. and to oversee the first peaceful democratic transition of power in Liberia for over 70 years. And so, I stand before you today, an imperfect leader from a complex post-conflict society on a continent of uneven progress and during a time of global uncertainties. As I look toward my twilight years and my closing chapter of restlessness, I would like to leave with you some of the lessons that the Liberian people have taught me, as well as their implications for the consolidation of democracy on the continent. Liberia's progression toward democratic values, as exemplified by the successful 2018 transition, is reflective of Africa's quest for democracy. It is a continuum of the continent's struggle for liberation and freedom. As Nelson Mandela said in March of 1991, I belong to the generation of leaders for whom the achievement of democracy was the defining challenge. Trends remain encouraging as young people empowered by education and technology demand their rights to be heard and to be listened to. Africa's evolution illustrates the strong causal effects between democracy and development. Afrobarometer finds that 7 out of 10 Africans believe democracy is preferable to all other forms of government. A number of countries, so many of our countries on the continent, including Ghana, Gambia, Senegal, Nigeria, Benin, Malawi, Botswana, Namibia, Kenya, Lesotho, Tanzania, Cote d'Ivoire, all have conducted free and fair elections belonging to a peaceful transition of power. And within democracies, political parties are self-correcting, as recently witnessed in South Africa. We also celebrate Sierra Leone, Liberia's neighbor, who this month completed a hotly contested presidential election. Like Liberia, Ghana, Nigeria, the incumbent political power ceded power peacefully to the opposition. Still, Africa's progress is filled with imperfections. Too many nations lag behind. Several continue to practice managed democracy void of real competition. Others cling to power for decades, deaf to the cries of their population for change. And too often, there's a violent rejection of election results. Political parties are organized by patronage and patriarchy. For most of them, democracy is practiced during the campaign cycle, but not necessarily within the party itself. This historical inequity is reinforced by a lack of campaign finance laws, which disproportionately prevent women and youth, two already disadvantaged groups, from taking on leadership role in political discourse, leaving the party apparatus to well-established economic and political cartels. In Africa, we tend to focus on elections, celebrate them as the milestone, but it is often said, elections do not a democracy make. We must look behind the process and examine the barriers that shut down competition before the campaign starts. Notwithstanding, I am convinced that these tendencies will not last, that our continent and other continents will continue the unstoppable march toward participatory democracy. We must identify the barriers to entry in political society and break them down one by one. Democracy must evolve from a single event into the institutionalization of a process that provides access to all its participants. We must look anew, not just as respecting constitutional term limits, but adjusting our Constitution to address campaign finance laws, to encourage the participation of women and the engagement of youth, and to strengthen the civil society. One cannot talk about democracy in Africa without noting the challenge of institutional and systemic corruption, an ill that fights back, often with an overpowering resistance of strength. I'm looking forward, I think Ngozi is here, to reading her latest book, in which she said, fighting corruption is dangerous. Rent-saving behavior becomes part of a survival skill and a corridor for greed. In response, we invested in integrity institutions and sought to hold officials responsible for the misuse of public funds. But sustainable change requires shifting the mentality of society and demands the ongoing collective effort of all branches of government across successive administrations. This is a challenge in our country that the administration of President George Weah will have to face and has committed to address. The good news is that corruption struggles to remain hidden in a world where technology and information systems increasingly showcase what passes from hand to hand. And social media has empowered everyday citizens to become watchdogs. Corruption, however, is also a double-edged sword and can be used against the innocent to discredit and disempower them.
Do you want to suck it to your boss?
I'm delighted that after 4 years, the former president of Malawi, my dear friend Joyce Banda, is returning home tomorrow. I'm convinced that with the courage to return, the rule of law will prevail and grant her justice. We must tackle the historical disadvantages which have made women political outsiders. I made history as the first woman democratically elected to lead an African nation. But 13 years later, there is not a single woman president on the continent. That is not okay. We must dig deep to address the societal, educational, and institutional barriers which disadvantage women. Again, we can learn from each other. And we look, as an example, Rwanda, which has excelled in every way, where quotas were constitutionally imposed to address historical inequities, and where, as a result, with the role played by women, today, Rwanda is the model African country to be followed. We must capture the political energy of our youth, open up the political system and lower the age of political participation. I'm sure that many of you have watched the sit-ins in Nigeria as the population mobilizes to reduce the age to participate in the House of Representatives, the Senate, and even the presidency in the aptly titled "Not Too Young to Run" campaign. And finally, toward the focal point of this conference, strengthening civil society, what can we do to inculcate a mentality of service with our young people to create institutions that attract the best and the brightest and reward those who enter. What innovative programs can be established to build capacity and instill values, given severe limitations in resources? When I assumed the presidency, we knew Liberia needed a professional civil service in order to thrive. But traditional mistrust, a legacy of corruption, meant that few talented candidates wanted to work in the public service. A bloated and largely unqualified public service distrustful of change posed a threat to the fragile peace. So we immediately recruited a small but talented cohort of Liberians responsible for three important objectives: create programs to attract talented civil service candidates from other sectors, develop training programs to build the skills in existing civil servants, strengthen the Liberian financial backbone by investing in the Ministry of Finance human capacity. With support from international partners, we introduced a repatriation initiative that brought talented Liberians home from the diaspora. We launched an innovative mentoring program to recruit and train young leaders through the President's Young Professional Program. We created a merit-based competitive path to government. Today, over 140 young leaders having gone through this process could be the bulwark of a modern and efficient civil service. While we live in an uncertain world, I, for one, remain optimistic, because from Africa to America, the future is in the hands of young people. They are taking charge and demanding that their voices be heard. They too are restless and impatient. They too are determined. Recently, while in the United States, a young student at Georgetown University shared with me a twist on the famous Serenity Prayer written by the American theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. He said, "Madam President, our generation is different. We are no longer asking God for the serenity to accept the things we cannot change. We are asking God and the Almighty to give us the courage to change the things we cannot accept." In closing, I can tell you that this restless soul cannot rest, will not rest, as there is so much work to do. One girl child to educate, one young boy to employ, one market woman to do literacy training, and so the work goes on. I will be working with a small team to establish Ellen Johnson Sirleaf Presidential Center for Women in Development. The center programs will be designed to support women as agents of change, makers of peace, and drivers of progress. In addition,